Welcome everyone to the repatriation webinar. It's been an especially hot topic for those in Hong Kong. It's tough times at the moment. So me and Matthew Jones are actually in Hong Kong, and David McMillan is sitting in Australia with us at the moment. All right, so let's get started. Some housekeeping. The session will be recorded. The slides will be shared after the webinar. So if you need to drop off or if you have any other questions, feel free to watch the webinar or drop us an email afterwards. If you have questions you want answered today on this webinar, feel free to ask them in the Q&A and we'll try our best to answer them towards the end. All right, so let's get started. Today's agenda, I'll go over the three speakers in front of you today, myself, Matt, and David. I'll lead the first section talking about financing in Australia. And then David will talk about the property section, followed by the repatriation and financial considerations by Matt from Oreana. Then we'll move into the Q&A session. All right, so you have myself from Odin Mortgage. We are Australian mortgage brokers for expats and overseas residents. Definitely one of the leaders in this space, and our service is entirely free. You have David McMillan, principal consultant from Performance Property. He leads a team of 60 in Australia and has performed over 3 billion transactions in Australia. Does everything from $500,000 investment properties to $10 million luxury properties. Then we have Matthew Jones, Senior Wealth Advisor from Oreana, 10 years of financial services experience, dual licensed across Hong Kong and Australia, and is able to help with onshore and offshore questions and assets. All right, so what are the main considerations before you repatriate back to Australia? Well, the first one is probably going to be personal. Where to work, where to send the kids. These questions are probably not going to be answered by us on this webinar. It's something for you to figure out personally. The second topic is property, accommodation, where you're going to be living, what you're going to be buying, and that will be the focus of my presentation and David's presentation, followed by finances. So repatriation, tax and planning, that'll be the focus of Matt's topic, presentation. All right, so common question that people ask me over the past 6 to 12 months is thinking about moving back in 6 to 18 months. Should I buy now? Should I buy later? And as with all things in life, there are pros and cons. The pros are that you're able to maximize your borrowing as an expat for that dream home, right? Another pro is it's a more efficient mortgage application. The third pro is reduced relocation logistics and headaches. So I'll go over all of these in detail over the next few slides, but this is just a summary. The cons are you have reduced income when you go back to Australia and there'll be high repayments. You cannot immediately claim any grants and you need to commit before settling down in Australia. So pros and cons to the approaches of buying as an expat. So what are the pros, right? The first pro is expat incomes are able to maximize borrowing for that dream home. Now I use dream home in italicized because it's not always that rosy, right? So expat income, dream home, why can you do that, right? It's because your incomes are higher when you're overseas, right? So you're probably earning 20% more, you're paying lower tax, you should have a stable bonus income over the past few years, and you can claim rental income on the property, right? So a lot of the time when people have these dream homes, it's not necessarily because they're richer, right? They're not super rich. It's just because they're able to take advantage of the situation and find the right channels to achieve these goals, right? Now, whether or not you should go for these dream homes and live beyond your means, that's a different question, right? So domestic income. So a lot of people will struggle with getting properties back at home. This is the comparison usually. Your lower income, 20% less. You're paying higher tax, 30 to 45% in the highest threshold. HEX loans. So if you've been running away from your HEX loans for the past 10, 20 years, this is where it's going to come back to hurt you. It's been compounding at inflation, and this is mandatory to be repaid when you're back in Australia. So unlike some expats in Hong Kong kind of avoiding this, you can't escape it when you move back to Australia. You have Medicare levy, you have 10% super. So all these things kind of add up, and it makes it a lot harder to maximize your borrowing. But again, that's not always a good thing to maximize your borrowing. The second pro is more efficient mortgage application, right? So banks prefer stability and certainty. So in the first column is the bank policy. The second column is your current situation. You have 3 months of pay slips. You have 2 years of bonus income. It's not a new industry or role. You're making minimum contributions. So those things banks like. It's stable, it's certain. But when you move back to Australia, you're probably going to need to wait 1 to 3 months for pay slips. You can't use your bonus because it's a new role or a new job. So that reduces your borrowing power. You need stability in the role. So if it's a new role, new firm, they don't like that. You need to pass probation, which could be 3 to 6 months. And then you start paying HECS and super and Medicare and all those things that I talked about. Now, the silver lining is obviously that when you're an expat, you have to pay a little bit extra for an investment loan, but we're easily able to turn that into an owner-occupier mortgage afterwards, right? Now, if you buy when you go back to Australia, obviously you are on an owner-occupier mortgage from day one. So the third pro, reduced logistics and headaches. So the key questions you kind of want to answer are, how long do you want to be in accommodation limbo, right? So do you want to move once directly into the home, or do you want to move twice into a hotel, to an Airbnb, back with the parents, or God forbid, with the mother-in-law, right? While you're waiting for the pay slips and stability in the role, right? Second question, how convenient is limbo for work and for school? If you're not moving into the home, how convenient is it to commute to work and school for the kids from your temporary accommodation? Now, even if those things are all right, like, will you like your team, the new role? If you don't like it and you change roles or you change jobs, then you're in limbo for another 3 months, all right? So I guess the final question is, how comfortable are you buying the property without physically seeing it, right? Do you trust your parents, your relatives to find you a property that you like? Or maybe you can consider leveraging on a buyer's agent to help you while you're overseas, especially if you're stuck in Hong Kong. And don't forget that all of this will be done in Australia without a helper. So get used to doing your own laundry as well. All right, so cons. The first con is obviously reduced income when you go back to Australia. So higher repayments. Yes, you can borrow more, but should you, right? Reduced income upon going back to Australia. Can you actually afford the repayments? Don't live beyond your means. Make sure you know the repayments per month that you can afford. And to do that, obviously just use any mortgage repayment calculator on the internet, or there's a link here to our one online. The second con, right? This is, for those who are joining late, I'm talking about the cons of buying as an expat, pros and cons. So the second con is you can't immediately claim grants, right? So the grants for stamp duties are only available at certain thresholds, depending on the state. And it's usually less relevant for anything above 600 to 700K, depending on the state. So usually not relevant for your expats anyway. First homeowner grants, it needs to be an owner-occupier home. They can be claimed in the future. The key takeaway is that it's generally not relevant for expats and high income earners and will be foregone. If you want more information on grants, you can definitely ask David later in the session. The final con is that you need to commit before settling down in Australia, right? So the risk of buying something you have not actually seen. So what are the mitigants? Well, start the process early and do not FOMO into the market, right? Buy in areas you are familiar with and understand, or experts understand. Leverage on friends and family, or utilize experts or buyer's agents to do due diligence, right? So those are, I guess, the pros and cons. So now I'll move into a case study or two. So this is a pretty typical client base of ours, or clientele. So family of 4 working in Hong Kong secured a role in Perth. They wanted to buy before repatriation. So Odin Mortgage, we came in, we helped them with a pre-approval for about 1.5 million at 2.89%. It was an investment property, and we went to an expat-friendly bank. 1 month later, they engaged a buyer's agent and they listed out their criteria. We want a 4-bedroom home for the kids, near the beach, has a swimming pool, near the primary school that we want to send the kids to. 6 months later, we were able to swap this investment mortgage to an owner-occupier mortgage and the family went back there. 2.49% owner-occupier rates at a Big Four bank. So that's your standard repat scenario. The second case study, which we also see sometimes, is similarly family of four, but this time they want the wife and the kids to move back first, right? But still they wanted to buy before repatriating. So expat pre-approval, we got them a $2 million mortgage, 2.89% investment property at an expat-friendly bank. They managed to independently secure that dream home for themselves, and the wife and kids moved back first while the husband stayed in Hong Kong. So the mortgage was then changed to owner-occupier. So those are the two case studies that we usually see. And just quickly going over what a pre-approval is for first home owners or anybody that's not familiar. Pre-approvals give you confirmation on how much you can borrow. They mitigate a loss against deposits in case you walk away. They give you negotiating power. They're valid for 3 to 6 months, and they cost you nothing. Okay? The timeline is usually you submit an online assessment with us. We give you options, you upload your documents, we submit, and then it's about 3 to 6 months for your loan to be fully pre-approved, and then you can start looking for your property and then signing the contract, settlement, and then obviously tax affairs with financial advisors. Last slide before I pass it over to David. Use an expat mortgage broker if you're based overseas. Avoid settlement headaches and maximize your negotiating power with a pre-approval, so come speak to us. And the last point is review your existing mortgage portfolio for cost savings and potentially releasing equity to assist with that purchase. So I'll keep my mortgage sections short, and I'll pass over to David now to talk about buying a property and giving you a general update on the market.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Can everyone hear me okay? Martin, can I get a thumbs up? Yeah, we're all good. All right, so I'll go back to the start of the slide. Guys, a little bit about our company before we get going. So we're investors, first and foremost, and we buy clients the same way we advise. We buy the same way personally as we advise our clients to buy. We're licensed real estate agents, certified practicing valuers, and qualified property investment advisors. We spend $500,000 a year researching the market. We've got 60 staff across the country, and our team has transacted a lot of property over our journey. We've been going 10 years. To summarize what we do, we buy residential and commercial property, building portfolios between 2 and 50 million. We buy prestige homes between 2 and 25 million. We manage our clients' property portfolios. We syndicate commercial property for wholesale investors, and we do all this Australia-wide. So if you're looking to buy a home before you come back in Perth, or you're looking to buy an investment property in Brisbane or anywhere across the country, we can facilitate that. I think it's worthwhile just for those of you who haven't seen our work before, going through the basics of how the market works, because it may influence whether you buy a home now, whether you invest now, depending on where in Australia you're thinking about relocating to, or when you're thinking about coming back to Australia. We've been studying the markets back to the 70s, which is when the data began. And the residential property market has a certain rhythm to it, and there's a price expansion cycle, and then there's a price contraction cycle. The price expansion cycle, which starts when markets show value at 6 o'clock, typically lasts 6 to 9 years. And the market typically over that period of time will grow anywhere from 50 to 150% in total growth. What happens then, the growth cycle comes to an end because the property market gets so expensive that the locals in that property market can't afford it. And it must go for correction and must allow for income to catch up to where property prices have risen to. That correction period typically lasts 4 to 7 years. And this is the red part of the clock that you're seeing here. And during that phase, typically prices have zero price growth. All right. So it's just a period of flat line price growth, no price growth, I should say, but no real softening of prices. Income's catching up, and then the market becomes affordable again, and then the process starts again. That's how the market's been running since the 70s. Okay. These are where the markets are around the country at the moment. So this is arguably one of the most important slides that we share. This is pretty much $500,000 per annum spend that allows us to have a view on where these markets are around the country right now. And this may influence the decisions that you make. So we're happy to share these slides afterwards with anyone that's interested. In terms of, if we're looking at this from a pure investment standpoint, when you go into different markets, it can be quite confusing, especially whilst you're abroad, to work out, okay, if we're going to invest in Adelaide, for example, how do I choose a suburb in Adelaide? What we've done is we've categorized every single suburb in Australia into 4 categories: AAA, Triple B, Triple C, and Triple D. This is based on its long-term compounding growth rate since 1980. And this allows you to sort of compare suburbs that are in different cities or that have different feels to them, such as Bondi and Toorak, or, you know, Paddington in Brisbane versus Coburg in Melbourne, Coburg in Melbourne versus Subiaco. All those suburbs that I just mentioned are AAA suburbs. And this is how we go about, this is the very clinical process that we go through to buy for a client. We start with a market that shows value. We buy in a AAA suburb only. And then the last step in this process is only buying homes. So if you're an investor and you want to put a rent vesting strategy in or a property portfolio together from a residential standpoint, it's actually a very simple formula from our side. Buy in a market that shows value, buy into a AAA suburb, and then only buy quality houses. That's the most effective way to passively invest in residential property in Australia. Here's the typical properties that we would buy for clients. So as you can see, quality character homes that vary in style as you move into different parts of Australia. Before we buy, there's a very thorough due diligence program. I'm not going to go into detail, but there's 15 points of due diligence that we buy to give you peace of mind that when you're buying from Hong Kong or from Singapore or wherever you might be, you know, how do I know that all these things are going to be checked? We check more than any person who would be a local buying. And if we made a recommendation to you to go to Martin's point about buying whilst you're still in Hong Kong or still in Singapore, before you buy, you get a video walkthrough of a property, you get a valuation of the property, you get a cash flow of the property, and you get a summary of the due diligence of the property, right? So it does give a lot of people confidence that they can buy from wherever they might be in the world. And in fact, from an investment standpoint, all of our clients in Melbourne never go and see the properties that we buy for them because we're not buying in Melbourne at the moment. So just to summarize that, and I'll get onto the markets in a little bit, if you are an investor and looking to put an investment strategy in place whilst you're away, we buy in markets that are in the value or momentum stages of the cycle. We buy triple suburb, we buy A-grade assets. We run it through a due diligence process. We run it through a 30-point grading process, which we do when we're physically inspecting the properties. And then lastly, we run it through a pricing analysis, and then a submission will be made to you. So back to the timing, because this may affect your desire to come back and buy when you're back, or to buy whilst you're still abroad. To go to Martin's point, possibly your borrowing capacity is going to be higher whilst you're abroad. You may want to take advantage of that. And if you're wanting to buy in Perth at the moment, Perth's a classic market that you should probably be buying in ASAP, because it's going to rise and rise aggressively over the next 12, 24 months, unless we get aggressive interest rate rises, which is always in the background for residential property investing. A different way of interpreting this clock, because some people find that confusing, is what we have done here is assessed. These are the key markets. The markets in green are the markets that we're actually buying in for investors at the moment. We like them for investment purposes. The markets in orange and obviously Sydney and Melbourne in yellow, we've highlighted them in different colors because we think at the moment Sydney is peaking. We think Newcastle's peaking. We think Wollongong's peaking. We think Central Coast is peaking. Most of regional New South Wales is actually peaking. Sydney market is softening. It's got a median price of 1.35 million. The average house in Sydney is 14 times the average income. And the Sydney market is starting to show signs of extreme weakness. And it looks like the median price is going to settle somewhere around the 1.3. If interest rates rise significantly, the median price is going to settle maybe 1, 2.5, something like that. It's very hard to tell because it's forecasting. So you're always going to be slightly wrong. But the reason why we've got such conviction on Sydney, and this is one of the most important graphs you'll see, is to explain how the markets work. The reason why we've got so much conviction on Sydney is because the rolling 90-day median price, if we use the rolling 90-day median price in Sydney, and we assume that someone's going to borrow 80% to buy that property, and we assume the average wage in Sydney, then the average mortgage repayment would be 61% of their wage. All right, so you can see these blue bar lines here are the percentage of the average wage that is consumed by the average mortgage repayment. We go all the way back to 1980. All right, so Martin, can you see this? Can you give me a nod if you can see this properly? The red, the green line here is the year-on-year price change, depending on where these debt services were in their respective years, right? And one of the things that's actually pretty certain is when you go back, whenever this affordability index in Sydney gets to 60%, you can see that in the corresponding year, prices in Sydney will come off. So you get to 60% in 89, prices come off. You got to 60% in 04, prices came off. We got to 60% in 08, prices came off. 60% in 2011, prices came off. 60% in 18, prices came off. Now, if we take the GFC, which is a classic, the reason why affordability improved so much over that 12-month period is because they slashed interest rates. And in fact, the reason why affordability improved back in the 90s is because they slashed interest rates. The difference here, the difference at this point in history versus going back 40 years is interest rates can't be slashed. Debt service cannot be improved by slashing interest rates because the cash rate is at 0.1. So this is the first time in history where Sydney's facing a 60% mortgage repayment from the average wage where the interest rate can't be slashed. So we have a very high conviction that we're seeing the top of the Sydney market. And the reason why that's so important is because nowhere in Australia goes past Sydney in terms of its median price. So Sydney has now set a ceiling, and that ceiling is 1.35. The ceiling may settle at 1.25 to 1.3. And the implications of that for the rest of the country is no median price of any city or town will probably get past 1.3, right? And all the other cities and towns in Australia have relationships to Sydney, like Melbourne gets to sort of 85% of Sydney and Geelong gets to X% of Sydney and so on and so forth. And that's why, and that's how we've put forward these potential upsides in these markets. And that's why we've got the probability of upside and downside of these markets based on the information that's coming through. So if you're an expat wanting to return to Sydney now, may not be urgency to buy that home. If you're an expat returning to Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth, I would suggest there is quite an urgency to buy a home because the market is set to rise, and we think this year the market will rise aggressively. Okay. Melbourne, fairly balanced on that because there still is going to be upside in that market, and it may be in your best interest to get in now before you come home. And I hope that makes sense, but I'll take questions afterwards. This is the last slide. Issues to watch in 2022, 2023. Our forecasting that you saw on the last page is factoring in the cash rate, making its way back up to 100 basis points. Okay. So in our forecasting, we have assumed that the rate of borrowing is probably going to settle at 3.5% or 4.5%, somewhere in that order when you go and borrow money from the bank. And this is the problem when you're forecasting property prices. You're always going to be wrong. Sorry, my wife's picking up the kids. You're always going to be wrong when you're forecasting property prices because you have to assume what interest rates are going to do. All right. So this forecast here is based on interest rates moving back up to a cash rate of 100 basis points. The next important point to acknowledge is rents are going to rise aggressively almost everywhere. We have a chronic undersupply of property almost everywhere. It's particularly bad in Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast. It's particularly bad in Perth. And Melbourne and Sydney, it will be particularly bad once the international student flow comes back to these cities, right? The reason why the undersupplies are so bad, we've had 10 years of underbuilding. We obviously had COVID-19 where a lot of projects were put on ice for a period of time. We have, and this is probably true of most areas around the world at the moment, we have building costs which are going through the roof. So developers are not building. And of course, now we've got borders opening up, and that's the perfect storm. Rents in the Gold Coast have gone up $400 a week in 2 years. Rents in Perth are going up $50 every month. It is going to be something that the papers start to talk about throughout the course of this year and definitely next year. It's moving into a rental crisis. So if you think you're going to come home and rent's going to be cheap, expect rents to rise. And that may also influence how you think about potentially buying property before you come back. In the markets where we are forecasting growth, so Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Bendigo, Toowoomba, Rockingham, we expect that growth this year to be aggressive, very aggressive, not like go up at 6% and 8%, mostly go up at 20 to 40%. That was the precedent that was set last year by Sydney, went up 20 to 40%, Sunshine Coast went up 40%, Gold Coast went up 40%, parts of Melbourne went up 40%. And that's just due to a chronic undersupply of property for sale, combined with a chronic undersupply of property to rent. And so there's a lot of pressure on markets to rise because there's not enough property to go around, and because property is still very affordable from a debt service point of view with interest rates where they are. All right. So if you are going to buy property, my view is that you would buy it before you move back, potentially with the exception of Sydney. Because by the time you get back and then have 3 months in a new role and then apply for finance, we could be talking about 2023, and prices, depending on where you are, excluding Sydney, could be 20 to 40% higher. I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Matt. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David. If you can just stop your screen, I'll share mine. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that fine. So thanks for joining, everyone. Today I'll do a quick run through of some of the key things to think about when it comes to repatriating or moving to Australia, along with some of the key tips and strategies from a financial planning perspective when it comes to purchasing Australian property. So some of the things to think about before you leave the country that you're in currently. So obtain valuations before, and in the case if you're going overseas after leaving Australia. Real estate, so obtain valuations so that CGT can be apportioned accurately. This is crucial for both Australian and overseas properties and assets as well. CGT on the latter is calculated from the day you become an Australian tax resident. So you need those valuations to be able to reset that cost base from becoming an Australian tax resident. Liquid assets, a little bit easier. You can crystallise these assets by doing deemed disposals and so forth. It's a good idea to be reviewing the strategy on these assets as well, and structures for tax efficiency, depending on your assets and situation. Consider winding up offshore trusts and structures, including offshore companies. That may be inefficient from an Australian tax perspective. This includes MPF, retirement schemes, such as also CPF in Singapore. They're actually considered foreign trusts from an ATO perspective, not foreign super. I hear that quite a lot, so don't fall into that trap. These are considered foreign trusts and actually can be taxed quite significantly on the capital gains from inception. And also just consider more tax efficient structures. Again, from an Australian tax perspective, this may include onshore or offshore trusts, superannuation, or taking advantage of opportunities to consider more tax efficient products such as portfolio bonds and the like. Receive termination payments, bonuses prior to repatriation. If you're coming from Asia, it's likely going to be able to provide a more favourable tax outcome on a lower tax residency rate. Employee share plan considerations. So again, it's different for every jurisdiction, but you guys in Singapore, gains can be taxed at departure. So it's best to review these entitlements. So thinking about those. And then obviously settling any final tax clearances with the relevant tax department to avoid delays in receiving your final salary payments. So after returning to Australia, it's really important to review your superannuation contribution strategy for tax efficiency. I'll come back to this in more detail in the following slides. Worldwide tax. So once you become an Australian tax resident, all of your assets are taxed worldwide. So it's really important to review your investment strategy. Review your lending arrangements as well. Obviously, it's been spoken about earlier in these slides. Restart Medicare, reinstate private health cover in Australia. Another advisor tip here that overseas private medical cover actually counts towards avoiding that Medicare surcharge. So keep your records there, and then just arranging all your general insurance and so forth. So in relation to property, some more tax considerations here, like the first two can actually save your bucket load. Understanding your tax residency, this will determine how you're taxed on income and capital gains. So when do you become a tax resident? Typically, you become a tax resident when you arrive back in Australia, if your intention is to return permanently at that point. For those already in Australia or spending more than half the year, it may be a bit more complicated, but it's based on current rules, it's when your intention changes to stay in Australia permanently, it can be at that point. So just keep those points in mind. There's currently, I know a lot of you will be aware, but there's currently proposals to change the current tax residency rules from intention to more of a bright line test plus economic ties to Australia. So this is going to remove a lot of that grey area and negate a lot of the private rulings that people have got in place. It's not yet finalised, and we'll be providing further information on the federal budget later this month. Avoid selling your property while you're a non-resident. For Australian tax purposes, you won't be entitled to the CGT exemption on your home. That's a big one. Rules changed on that recently. There's no CGT discounting as well. This is also the same if you're in Australia based on the time you're abroad. And it's often a higher tax rate as well while you're a non-resident for tax purposes. So if you can wait until you're back in Australia, particularly if it's your home, you can actually look at the 6-year rule. So for instance, if you were in your home, you moved overseas, you can rent it out for a period of time up to a maximum of 6 years. If you move back into your home, you can reclaim that as your principal residence and apply that CGT exemption at sale. So really key that it's within that 6 years. But if you sell it while you're offshore, you won't be able to claim that. So just really important there to think about the timing of sale and your tax residency. 50% discounting on CGT. So this is applied for investment assets that are held more than 12 months. You can apply a 50% discount on CGT as an Australian tax resident. Just a few others here. So maximise your deductions, maintenance, upkeep, land tax, strata fees. These are all tax deductible. And of course, loan interest on related borrowings. Carry forward tax credits and losses. These are really important as well. So negative gearing strategies while you're offshore. If you're in a position where your costs are above what you're receiving in rental, you can actually accumulate these losses on your tax return every year, carry these forward and use these to offset gains or income at a later date. Losses, if you've sold a property at a loss, you can actually use these to offset capital gains as well. So from an insurance perspective, again, just thinking through more considerations here from a planning perspective when purchasing property. So if you're buying property, whether this is overseas or Australia, and you're financing this from borrowing, it's really important to, I guess, consider this as your second step. Property is an illiquid asset, which means it cannot be sold or redeemed quickly, like a share portfolio, for instance, if something happened. Besides, if it's your home, the last thing you want to be doing is burdening yourself or your family to have to sell your home in the case of a death or a permanent disability. So for peace of mind, we always say, at a bare minimum, look at life and TPD cover. Life cover is as it sounds, it pays out a lump sum on death. TPD is total and permanent disability. If you suffer from an illness or accident and you're no longer able to work. Typically, a rule of thumb, we say that any debt that's not covered by liquid assets or cash or shares or investments that you can easily redeem to repay that debt if something would happen, you should be insuring from a life and TPD perspective. Advisor tip here that if you structure life and TPD within superannuation, which you can do, an advisor can help you with this, the premiums are tax deductible at the superannuation rate. So you'll reduce the actual real cost of those premiums as well. Income protection. This is an income stream that will kick in if you're unable to work from an illness or injury. You don't need to be permanently disabled like TPD. So this is very useful if you can, to help you fund expenses, mortgage repayments, etc., until you get back on your feet. Another advisor tip here, income protection is 100% tax deductible if you own it personally. That's if you're offshore or onshore and you've got Australian tax to offset. So tax, this is obviously the big one based on all the questions that have come through in the lead up here. So gearing is obviously the first cab off the rank here. Neutral gearing is where income is basically the same as the costs. It's neutral. The strategy here that you're looking to basically buy a property or a portfolio of properties and look to get a capital gain and make your profit through sale. Negative gearing is actually where the costs are more than the income you're receiving. As mentioned earlier, these losses can be accrued to offset capital gains or even Australian income when you do relocate back to Australia. If your tax rate is higher when you repatriate to Australia, you can actually use these tax credits to offset a higher rate of tax. So another strategy here that relies on this in relation, so personal debt on a home or assets that's not generating income does not offer any tax deduction. So it's always a strategy to maximise the investment debt that you've got on rental properties or taxable investments and minimise any personal debt that you've got. A really effective strategy that we implement a lot for clients that are repatriating or reverse equity mortgages, where you can really optimise your tax efficiency. So basically, if you've got personal debt, mortgage on the home, or you're moving into a rental property, for instance, and now that debt's becoming personal, you can look at utilising cash, liquid assets to pay down this personal debt. You look at refinancing and investing for investment purposes or using that loan for investment purposes. So you can keep your overall loan to assets LVR at the same level, yet you've drastically improved your tax optimisation on your situation. So superannuation here, basically, there are a range of strategies here. You get tax deductions for making contributions to superannuation that can offset Australian taxable income. So the first ones here, concessional, salary sacrifice, personal contributions, they go by a couple of different names. The maximum rate here is $27,500 per annum. So you can't dump a lot into super in one time, but really effective on a year-on-year strategy to reduce your income. And these can be made while you're offshore to offset Australian taxable income if, for instance, you're earning rental above your income, above your costs. The key here that these concessional contributions, they'll give you a tax deduction, but it's not an expense. So you're literally just investing in your retirement fund and you'll get a tax deduction for doing so. So really effective. Further to that, there's actually catch-up concessional contributions that you can implement as well. This is where you go back and use previous year's unused cap, if you will, of that 27,000, or it was 25,000 last year and in previous years. This is a really good one for returning expats because you can actually utilise previous year's unused concessional contributions cap and make a larger contribution in 1 year. This can be used to offset your employment income when you return to Australia, or the CGT if you sell a property. That can be offshore, or whether it's after when you come back onshore as well. And then finally here, non-concessional contributions. So these are after-tax contributions, effective for building up your super, but also moving large amounts of cash or liquid assets into super, which has a lower tax environment. Superannuation is taxed at 15%. With discounting, it's only 10% on capital gains. that can be compared to your marginal tax rate anywhere up to 47%. So you can build your assets or invest your assets more tax efficiently. You can also do, you can make a contribution up to 110,000 per annum. And you also have the ability to do 3 years in one. So you can bring forward those contributions. So for husband and wife, for instance, moving back to Australia or partner, you can both look at making those contributions and effectively move a lot of wealth into superannuation, which is concessionally taxed on top of concessional contributions, if you look at that. The next one are offshore products. So if you've listened to a lot of our webinars, we speak a lot to these. They're really useful for expats returning to Australia. So portfolio bonds, they're insurance wrapper products with concessional tax treatment by the ATO, subject to specific guidelines. They're really low cost strategies. You can typically invest or hold liquid investments. The guidelines are that you're subject to 125% contribution rule, which means you can only make up to 125% of the immediately previous year's contribution. So there are mandates there you've got to be on top of. But effectively, all capital gains are tax deferred within this product up until 10 years, and then you can access all of the capital and the returns tax-free. You can take that as a lump sum, or you can draw an income, or you can continue it. Really good for tax, for estate planning as well. Foreign super is more in relation to offshore trust structures that meet foreign super definition. These are more open architecture. So if you've got collectives, private equity, art, gold bullion, for instance, these trusts can hold these assets. So it's a bit of it's a preclusion with portfolio bonds. So these are quite useful for those high net worth clients, or if you've got these sort of assets to structure more tax efficiently from an Australian perspective. They're uncapped on contributions as well, and withdrawals from age 55. So that's before you can access your super. You can only access your super from age 60. So you get 5 years there. You can access this invested capital in Australia more tax effectively. So with these strategies, gearing combined with maximising your eligible super contributions, along with implementing offshore structures where appropriate, you can really optimise your tax efficiency when you're repatriating back to Australia. So from a wealth creation perspective, putting the advisor hat on, it is really important to diversify. So not to take away from the theme of today, but from an advice perspective, it is important to diversify your overall wealth. If you're heavy on property, for instance, you may consider investing a portion of your assets in other investments. This doesn't always mean stocks. It could be private credit, private equity, fixed income, a range of other asset classes that may suit your objectives. Diversifying your liquidity as well. So as mentioned, property is illiquid. It can take time to sell, and it might not always make sense to sell when you need those funds. So it is important to diversify liquidity through different asset classes. Again, so some of those asset classes I just mentioned, equities are obviously most common, and also for further tax efficiency as well. Often it can be easier to restructure liquid assets when you're repatriating as well. So forward planning there. And then finally, just with these building superannuation, I've touched on it a bit here, but returns are taxed lower. You can also draw an income stream from invested capital as well. So diversifying your overall structure or wealth strategy is a good idea from a tax planning perspective. So just finally, I guess from a markets perspective, when it comes to the markets, there's a lot going on right now, obviously, in the world. Inflation, interest rates looming, obviously war in the Ukraine, to name a few. However, from an economic health perspective, we're still seeing strong lead indicators for continued global growth. This global PMI chart here indicates the direction of economic growth continuing. Our fundamental view is that it hasn't changed on markets and the economic outlook. We're still in the start of an economic cycle, which still provides a lot of growth side and optimism when we look through into the fundamentals. So with markets coming off recently, there's actually a lot of upside potential as well. So I guess keeping in the theme here in reference to for an Australian themed webinar, I've just included our projected fair value pricing for the Australian Share Index. These lines here indicate the attractiveness of buying Aussie stocks. If the index value increases to the top line here, our view is that it's overvalued and perhaps a time to sell. Prices at the lower lines there obviously indicate undervalued, and therefore upside to reach fair value. Right now, you can see here that the price of the index has fallen below our most attractive rating. So just something to think about there from an equity perspective. That's it for me. So I think we're going to open up to Q&A now. So Martin, I might throw back to you.
Yep, awesome. So yeah, we have a list of questions that people asked when they signed on to the webinar. I'll go through some of those. If you have any other questions, please also drop them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through as much as we can in the next 15, 20 minutes. All right, so first question for Matt is there any update on the 45-day rule for tax residency status?
At the moment, no. It's been really quiet. Not since the federal budget was announced last year. So the federal budget this year has actually been brought forward. It's on the 29th of March. We'll obviously be watching that really closely to see if there are any changes announced. So we'll be doing a piece on that. So maybe follow us.
If that does get pushed ahead on the 29th of March, when is the earliest it would be put into practice? Would it be the 1st of July this year or next year?
Yeah, good question. So again, it's really hard to say, but unlikely they'll bring it in this July. I just think the turnaround's too tight. There's a lot of things going on. So plus being a pre-election budget as well. So I think it's intended to be a July 1 thing. So it'll come in 1 July. I think at this point it'll be likely 2023, but yeah, just follow this.
Okay, cool. All right, so I've got someone asking a mortgage question. My husband is an Australian citizen and I am a New Zealand citizen. Do I have to be an Australian citizen to purchase a property? No, you don't. Foreigners can also buy a property, and you can really leverage on your husband's nationality to get a mortgage and also buy the property. Will be a little bit of extra stamp duty as a New Zealand or Kiwi or foreigner, but we can structure it in a way that minimizes tax. All right, question for David on property. I keep seeing articles saying apartments in Australia are in trouble, but I don't think I can afford a house. Is there any upside on bigger city apartments?
Look, if you go back to our slide deck, which you'll receive in an email, we think apartments are C or D grade assets. They come at an opportunity cost to buying houses. And what I mean by that is historically houses have compounded at 6%, but high density apartments have compounded at 4% per annum, and low density apartments have compounded at 6% per annum, right? So you leave money on the table long-term if you invest in an apartment. It's black and white. However, if you can't afford a house, then an apartment is the next logical choice. Sorry, a townhouse is the next logical choice. And if you can't afford a townhouse, then you should buy a low density apartment. As far as the market forecast goes, we think that because of the accommodation crisis that's going on in Australia at the moment, we're going to see rental growth in the next 12, 24 months almost everywhere. And in some cases, it will be aggressive. And this will basically force up apartment prices. So it's perhaps the opposite of what you're reading. There has been a lot of talk about the Melbourne and Sydney apartment markets coming off because of the international students not coming in and those apartments not filling up. But I think that tide is about to turn, and I think we are going to see positive price growth on apartments in the next 2 to 4 years.
Okay. Matt, how do citizens declare their source of funds when transferring large amounts back to Australia? Are there any tax implications if I move back a large amount of my assets or funds, I guess?
In terms of cash, I mean, banks do their DD on transfers. So on that front, declaring and so forth, just work with them. From a tax perspective, there's no tax to be paid on cash transfers unless there's a gain on the currency conversion. But again, if that's only if you're an Australian resident, if you're based up here in Hong Kong or Singapore.
Related to that is like, how do you ensure your foreign assets remain as valuable as possible? So I guess one situation could be you own foreign shares in Hong Kong or Singapore. What happens to those when you move back to Australia?
Yeah, so tax residency or capital gains tax, however you want to refer to that, starts from the date you become an Australian tax resident. So best option there is either is really just to get valuations at that date. Anything before that, for instance, if you're in Hong Kong or Singapore, is tax-free. And then starting from that date, that's your new cost base, and that's what capital gains will be taxed on. Aussie shares a little bit different. You may need to do a deemed disposal on those at that date or prior to that date, just to make sure that it's nice and clean when you become an Australian tax resident again.
Yeah. Okay. Two easy ones for mortgage. Is it possible to refinance your mortgage while overseas? Quick answer is yes. Is there any additional stamp duty for non-resident Australian citizens? There are no additional stamp duties for being a citizen. Okay. Moving on to property. What happens when all markets are in the correction phase of your clock, David? And I guess the $1 million question is, how long will this boom last?
Well, the boom will last until all markets become unaffordable. That's typically how things go. And when everything moves into the correction phase, if you still want to invest in property, you've got to find yield-based strategies, right? Your options are not invest for a while because there's no reason to, or then you move into a yield-based property strategy mode, and commercial property and commercial syndication becomes more relevant at those times. You know, it should last, the corrections historically last between 4 to 6 years.
Okay. Tax question for you, Matt. With the current remote work arrangements, I guess this applies to a lot of people stuck in Australia at the moment. How long can I work in Australia under my Hong Kong employer and enjoy Hong Kong tax rates?
Yeah, okay. So again, another sort of tricky one. Under current rules, there are a number of tests, and it really looks at your intentions. So typically you'll have up to 183 days, a half a year. You can do that pretty easily without having to argue too much with the ATO on that. If you are stuck in Australia or you remain longer than that and your intention or your still habitual abode is still in Hong Kong, I'd suggest getting a private ruling, get some tax advice on that, just to avoid any grey area. Just to add to that, I guess with the new proposals, they're legislated to reduce that time frame. Well, if it is over 183 days, there's no negotiation. You are an Australian tax resident. If it's less than that period, but more than 45 days, then they look at a number of factor tests as well. So that looks at your citizenship or right to abode, if you've got accommodation in Australia, family, if your family's in Australia, or if you've got economic interest, including property, large amounts of cash, or if you're working or getting employment income in Australia, those factors will tip you over. So again, it's really important just to see what comes out of this budget and when those new residency rules come in.
So someone's asked here, trend of interest rates. So I think this is actually a really interesting question because if you came to Odin Mortgage 6 months ago, we were able to get investment mortgages for around 2.5% and maybe up to like the 2.89%. But that's almost impossible now because most banks have lifted their rates by anywhere between 50 to 80 basis points. So 2-year fixed rates, most of the banks at the moment, they're above 3%. So it's actually getting quite expensive. And what you're seeing is that the variable rates are actually a little bit lower. And whether or not this is a strategic move by the banks to kind of push everyone down the variable path and then wait for those rates to lift, I'll leave that kind of to you guys, because nobody knows what the bank strategy is. But at the moment, the fixed rate's actually more expensive than the variable rates, but that could change. Okay, next question for David. I have a B grade rental property in Brisbane that I'm simply over. And he's thinking, or they are thinking about liquidating that to get into another asset. Should they do that now or later?
Well, look, I think there's a tax issue if you're overseas. You won't get the CGT discount. So you really try to avoid selling anything whilst you're overseas. As far as rolling a B grade asset into a different A grade asset, yes, there are times to do it and times not to do it. We'd need more information, and it's a personal advice question, so I'd like to take that one offline.
Yeah, and then a question related to that that's popped up a few times here is, if we were to move back to Australia and live in the property, how long would we have to live in it before we can claim these tax benefits? I guess that's a question from Matt.
Yeah, not for me. I'll dodge that one.
Yeah, so if you've owned the property for more than 12 months, the day that you become an Australian tax resident, but you can't claim that 50% CGT discount for the period it was overseas. That'll be apportioned to the time moving forward as an Australian tax resident. If you move into your property, again, it's apportioned. So you can't move into a rental property and then claim as your home the whole period. So you'll have to pay tax on that if you sell it later on.
Okay. David, how do you see the Darwin market?
I'll send, if anyone wants information on any market, including Darwin or otherwise, I can send the research reports to them. It's very much close to the bottom of the cycle, strong upside next 5 years.
Yeah. Another one, if you're on a 2-year time frame to return, would you buy now and realize the capital gain in rental income? Would that be enough to offset the capital gains that I would need to pay later if I sell?
A bit confused by that question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, so look, I was a bit confused as well, but I think what they're trying to say is if they buy now, would the rental income and the gains be more than the capital gains that they will have to eventually pay? So it's really a question of buy now or buy when they get back to Australia.
So I'm presuming if they're selling now, that frees them up to buy now. Is that the gist of the question, perhaps?
Look, maybe MCB can ask again, and then we'll try to answer that question in a different way.
I think the same rules apply. You should really avoid selling anything whilst you're abroad because you're not going to get access to the CGT discount. To go to Matt's point about the valuations, if you find a good contact back in Australia who can help with valuations and give you sort of different ends of the valuation scale to improve your tax rate, because the ATO aren't that pedantic about the numbers, they just want a valuation there. That can really help with that. But every expat I come into contact with, when we do the numbers around selling whilst they're away, it just doesn't work. It never really works, especially if there's a large gain there.
Yeah. Is it possible to share your due diligence checklist, or maybe you can give a summary of it, just a teaser?
Sure. Well, I mean, there is half a summary in the slide deck already, and I'm more than happy to share that. That's fine. I can do that.
Is there any timing benefit returning to Australia in the current financial year or the new financial year, Matt?
Not really. I think that more relates to, particularly if you're coming from a jurisdiction such as Hong Kong and Singapore, where there's no capital gains. It's really important to be selling those up or realising those, or putting in place what you need to do, the planning arrangements prior to your repatriation, because it's more difficult, or you'll be paying tax after your return. So tax residency starts when you arrive, if your intention is to repatriate at that date. So unless there's changes on July 1 with the residency rules, which I can't answer yet until the budget comes out, I don't think there's a massive difference.
Okay. Which areas in Perth would you recommend to invest in, David?
Oh, look, Perth, the history of Perth, if you go back and look at the research report, it stays flat for 10 to 12 years and then it doubles or triples in 5 years. So flat for 10 to 12, then doubles or triples in 5. When the Perth market runs, everywhere runs. Our focus from an investment standpoint, as I mentioned in the slide deck, is only focusing on AAA suburbs. So, you know, your Cottesloes and your Vic Parks and your Subiacos and your Fremantles, that's always a focus because we have a focus on quality property, but all markets should run. You just need to be cautious and do your due diligence before you buy.
Okay. All right, question from Wilkin. Is there a time limit on how long after you were out of the Australian tax system you can contribute cash up concessional contributions, i.e. out of Australia for 7 years, returned to Australia for 8 years, but now back overseas? Can they contribute for the first 7 years they were outside of Australia?
Yeah, so I think that's in reference to catch-up concessional contributions. So if you've got unused cap, going back and you effectively utilising that cap to make a larger contribution in this year, for instance. The answer there is yes. You can only go back as far as the 2019 financial year when this new rule was brought in.
Okay. Are there any tax implications if I were to buy a house in Australia that my wife and kids live in while I remain overseas indefinitely?
Residency rule changes may affect this. So again, if you're spending time in Australia, which likely you would be, you'll tip the scales in that 45 days. With those factor tests, you'll be, if you're an Australian citizen or a PR, plus owning a home in Australia. Even wife and kids back in Australia is another one as well. So that can deem you as an Australian tax resident. So be really careful on that front. Under the current rules, as long as your habitual right of abode is in another country, you can skirt that. But again, it becomes challenging to prove that to the ATO over time, the longer that goes on.
Yeah. Okay, so there's some questions that I'm not asking because they're quite specific and wouldn't benefit the other attendees. So I picked the ones that are relevant to more people. Does Australian residency change on the date of arrival?
Yes. Short answer. If your intention is at that point when you're landing to live in Australia, it's a day you land. If you're going back for a holiday, for instance, and you're not tipping any of those day rules, it's fine. You won't be an Australian tax resident.
Yep. So one question from Jacinta. Can you receive Australian super income after retirement while living overseas?
Short answer is yes. So just being mindful that it's, so firstly, subject to preservation rules, you need to be met your preservation age, which is age 60 for anyone now that hasn't met it yet, and retirement or or at age 65 regardless. So meet preservation and you can actually access your super. And then if you're drawing that, it's tax-free in Australia, but be mindful of how you're taxed in the country that you're actually a tax resident of. If you're overseas, that income may be taxed locally. So just be mindful of that.
So David Chance asked the question, can you sell an Australian property owned by a non-resident to local residents or another overseas buyer? I'm not sure who this one's for, but the answer is you can sell it, but the common theme throughout is you shouldn't sell while you're overseas if you're an Australian citizen, because you won't get those benefits. Another question for you, Matt. Can you retrospectively crystallize Australian private shares from when you first became non-resident?
Depending on when. Short answer is no. yeah, really difficult to do. And you can't amend tax returns more than 2 years ago either. So that's probably a no.
Yeah. David, so MCB has rephrased his question. If you're on a 2-year time frame to return, would you buy now, realize the capital gain and rental income? Would that generally offset the CGT you'd need to pay later if you sell?
Why are we selling though? Are we selling so that to free up additional capital to buy? Like that's what I'm not clear on.
Right. Maybe MCB can just reach out to David directly afterwards.
Just email me direct. I think it's a personal question, and it's a mathematical sort of equation. But there needs to be a reason for selling, and if the reason for selling is to buy something, get more borrowing capacity, and pull the pool of cash together to buy something bigger, maybe. Depends on the market as well.
Okay, great. Look, so the other questions, they're a bit niche and probably not that relevant to other attendees. So we're probably going to wrap it up here. If you have questions, our contact details are on the screen. Definitely try to reach out directly, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can offline. Thanks everyone for your time, and best of luck. All right.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.